Hey everybody, I'm back again to tell you about the presidential election of 1792. This is a race where George Washington gets reelected unanimously to a second term. John Adams is elected vice president for a second term. Some of the things that happened in 1792 are kind of unique in American history. Some aren't. This is probably going to be a little bit shorter of a presentation because there's not a whole lot or as much to say. Although some of the background story is kind of interesting too for 1792. So let's just hop into it. One thing I want to begin with is the issue of, at the time, it was relatively in the early time period in the United States history, it was rare for the president and vice president to serve 2 terms. Let me switch this to make this bigger and we'll get into this list of president and vice president teams who served 2 terms. You'll see at the beginning of the Republic, this happened twice, which is the first president and the 5th president served with 2 terms with their vice president. Since that time, we've had 7 teams, almost all in the past 11 decades. Well, I mean, they're all in the past 11 decades. So about half the time since 1913, we have had a president and vice presidential team that served 2 terms. Unlike before, because you can see that for 90 years, it didn't happen at all in between these two. Okay, an important thing about presidential terms is the cabinet. I won't always go into the cabinet, but some interesting things happened in George Washington's first cabinet. Initially, the cabinet was the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, and the Secretary of War. The Attorney General was only added after the 1792 election, but soon afterwards. Edmund Randolph, the Attorney General, had already been appointed and he was already serving, but for some reason he wasn't considered to be part of the cabinet until after 1792. The rest of the cabinet, Henry Knox continued as the Secretary of War, a position that he held in the Confederation Congress. And Thomas Jefferson was appointed Secretary of State, but he was in France. So Washington recalled him, but in the meantime, the U.S. had John Jay serving as acting Secretary of State. He had been the Secretary of Foreign Affairs under the Confederation Congress. And Alexander Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury. So what was happening in the first year of the government under the Constitution was that John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and Henry Knox would meet with George Washington. And the three of them mostly agreed on topics of how to get the government up and running under the Constitution. Of the three, Hamilton stood out to an extent because he wanted to do more than the other three wanted to do, but for the most part, they agreed on things. Well, that changed when Thomas Jefferson arrived because he was completely against a lot of the stuff that had been agreed upon up into that time, and that resulted in some contentious cabinet meetings. And that's one of the reasons that Edmund Randolph started to attend cabinet meetings as Attorney General, because he was inclined to agree with Jefferson on some things, even though he had supported the Constitution when Virginia was having its debate about whether to ratify it. Okay, so here is a quick overview of what was happening in Congress. The Congress met in Federal Hall in New York City from 1789 until 1790. Then it moved to Philadelphia. And during the first Congress, most of what's on this list here was passed. The Bill of Rights was a series of amendments to the U.S. Constitution that the Inter-Federalists had sought. James Madison, who's in the upper left here, was opposed to this whole idea of having a Bill of Rights. We didn't have one under the Articles of Confederation, so why do we need one now? The stuff people are asking about are things the federal government didn't even have the authority to do under the Constitution. So why are we doing this? And he also made the argument of if you have a Bill of Rights with certain things listed, the federal government could look at that and do something that's not on the list, right? Because if it's not on the list, then you can do it. And that's why the 10th Amendment was put in there, that anything that's not specifically given to the federal government is reserved to the states. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution constitute the Bill of Rights. Originally, Congress had approved 12 things, 12 amendments, not just 10. One of them was just never ratified, and another one was ratified much, much later. Okay, so the next major thing that Madison did was to draft a tariff that was approved of 5% on imports from other countries. This was an important thing because this meant that for the first time, the federal government had a good financial footing. Unlike the Confederation Congress, where they were constantly running out of money and having to ask states to send more money, and sometimes they would send it late, and it was just a mess. But this tariff meant that the federal government had a recurring source of income that they could spend on things. We discussed the cabinet. John Jay was appointed Chief Justice. He was also serving as the acting Secretary of State, which is kind of weird. But the Supreme Court didn't have a whole lot to do in these early years. Okay, so John Jay was appointed, associate justices were appointed, so we had the U.S. Supreme Court. Most of the stuff that was controversial had to do with Alexander Hamilton's ideas. Alexander Hamilton was a real idea person. He liked to come up, sort of brainstorm what would be some good things to do to put the United States on a secure financial footing. That was his job. He was Secretary of the Treasury. And he would come up with these various ideas and take them to the cabinet. They would agree, and so he would draft something to take to Congress for them to consider. And he wasn't as good about the buy-in from Congress. He kind of felt like, we come up with these proposals, why don't you just vote for them? And so these things here on the list, they just voted them down. And like the first one, the Assumption Act, this was a bill that stated that the federal government would assume all of the Revolutionary War debts of the various states. Also, something that's not mentioned as much, states with no Revolutionary War debt, the federal government just sent them a check for a bunch of money. And for some reason, Congress voted that down like 3 times. So Hamilton was out on the street one day in Philadelphia, and he saw Thomas Jefferson, and they said, we've got to figure this out. So they sat down, they came up with a compromise. So the southern states would vote for the federal assumption of debt. And in exchange, the U.S. Capitol would eventually make its way to Washington, D.C. They said somewhere along the Potomac because they hadn't picked a site yet. But that was the deal. The National Bank was established. George Washington was really unsure about this at the time, but Hamilton convinced him after he had convinced Congress. And the National Bank was established. And of course, the U.S. Mint was really important to start to mint coins with the words United States on them. So people would have actual dollar coins. They were made out of silver. Some coins were made out of copper, like the 1 cent coin, the half-cent coin were made out of copper. Um, one thing about the mint is that, interestingly enough, the diplomats from England and France would come and buy just bags and bags of coins that they would send back home. So it took a while for US coins to actually circulate well in the United States, but Hamilton got it set up. Okay, this is a photograph of the north side of Independence Hall, and it shows where some of the branches of the federal government met in the 1790s. The Supreme Court, now this is facing south, so the Supreme Court met in the wing off to the east. The wing off to the west, which is called Congress Hall. The U.S. Senate met on the second floor and the House on the first floor. One block away was this building. This is where George Washington lived in the 1790s. And this building was torn down a long time ago, but just recently, some archaeologists came and dug up the site, and they found that Washington had a tunnel that led from the main part of the house to the back part of the house. This would be for his slaves that he had brought from Virginia to do things for him so that they wouldn't be seen by visitors. Now, John Adams, I don't have a picture of where he lived in at the time. He rented a house temporarily and he thought it was too much money, so he was going to move into a boarding house, which a lot of members of Congress did. And one day he was talking to the Secretary of the Senate, Samuel Otis, the guy who held the Bible in 1789 for George Washington. And Otis said, it's not really appropriate for the vice president to live in a boarding house. And he said, you know what? I have a room, a guest room. Why don't you just stay with me? So he moved there into that room. John Adams did. Thomas Jefferson rented a house in Philadelphia. He came with a caravan of carriages. And get this, with 75 crates of stuff that he brought from Monticello to fill that house. Just wow. Yeah, so it's interesting that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington lived such a a luxurious life, and John Adams didn't. Okay, so on George Washington's birthday in 1792, Congress passed an act that covered some things related to the presidency. At that time, congressional legislation didn't really it wasn't given a name. So since then, people give it names, but these names aren't consistent. The most common name for this act is the Electoral Act of 1792. And it did two things. It established the line of succession, which you see here, and it established the parameters for the presidential election. Okay. Let's look at the parameters here. It created a range of days for the states, if they wanted to elect presidential electors by popular vote, to do that. Unlike 1789, where the presidential electors were elected on the same day, although in Maryland they extended it 2 days. Other than that, presidential electors were elected on the same day. So beginning in 1792, states vote on different days for president. And this continues until 1844, and it has implications for the results of some elections. And it also had some implications because as transportation improves, it makes it easier for a person to travel to a different county and try to vote a second time, which is why this ended and it was all moved to the same date. Okay, then the time for the presidential electors to gather to cast the electoral vote was fixed. All the presidential electors met on the same day, although that day would float in the calendar. It was not set to a day. And when the presidential electors met, they had to sign 3 copies of their electoral votes. They would mail one to Washington to the vice president's office and put one with a local judge and appoint somebody as messenger to deliver the 3rd copy to the vice president's office. And being a messenger was a real coveted assignment at the time because they paid 25 cents per mile, which is pretty good because I only get paid 50 cents per mile right now. Yeah, so messengers got paid quite a bit of money to deliver the electoral vote, and people in the vice president's office, I don't know who, but somebody, maybe the vice president, would compare the two just to make sure that they were the same. Then March the 4th was set as Federal Inauguration Day. This is the beginning of the terms of the president and Congress. Vice president, too. So March 4 continues to be Inauguration Day until 1933. Okay. Now, another thing that happened during the first Congress is the first United States Census was conducted. And you can see the United States had about, slightly less than 4 million people that were counted. They divided everybody into 3 categories, which are these 3. It's kind of interesting that it would be kind of interesting if they would have specified, are these free blacks, somebody else? I mean, Native Americans? Since they didn't provide names in the census in 1790, we don't have a good sense of who all these people were. But these numbers were used to generate the members of U.S. House beginning in 1793, and also the presidential electors. So you can see at the Constitutional Convention, they did a pretty good job of evaluating the sizes of the states. They had overstated how big Georgia was, and so Georgia lost an electoral vote. Delaware, being the smallest state, was guaranteed 3, and everybody else gained at least 1. Some gained more. Now, in this particular one, this compares the electoral vote of 1792 with 1789. So, like North Carolina is plus 12. They didn't gain 12. It was a gain compared to 1789. 2 states had been added to the Union from divisions of other states, and those were Vermont and Kentucky. So that's where their plus numbers come from. Okay. During the first Congress, once Thomas Jefferson had returned from France, the old alignment of Federalists and Anti-Federalists really fell apart. It was meaningless, particularly after the Bill of Rights was approved, because that was the Anti-Federalist reason for being, to try to place some limits on the federal government under the Constitution. In general, the opposition party, which initially took the name Republican, preferred a weak federal government. Now, the name of this party sort of floated over time. A lot of you'll see sometimes historians will insist that they were always called the Republicans and never the Democratic Republicans. Contemporary newspapers show that the first time that phrase Democratic Republican Party was used was in 1794 in Vermont by somebody, a newspaper of that persuasion. So these labels were in use. And in fact, in Pennsylvania, the dominant label for the opposition party was the Democratic Party all the way back to 1800. Yeah. And I did a search in newspapers.com, though, and in 1792, the only label for the the label that the opposition used was the Republicans. The Federalists sometimes called them something else I'll get to shortly. Okay, so the Republicans preferred a weak federal government, which means they opposed what Alexander Hamilton was doing, and the Federalists generally agreed with Alexander Hamilton, so they wanted a stronger federal government. Now, when Thomas Jefferson was in France, he saw what happened with the French Revolution and how bad it was. And people in the United States were really horrified by what was going on over there. Now, Thomas Jefferson was sort of afraid that something like that could happen over here, that the people left out at the bottom, these farmers who, let's say, tenant farmers who really weren't being represented, would rise up against everybody else and kill all the rich people and take their land. Yeah, so he sort of sympathized with them. He claimed that he sympathized with them, which is very funny because he was not one of them. He was one of the wealthiest people in the country. And I mean, if the workers in Philadelphia decided they were going to rise up and they went to Thomas Jefferson's place and looked how he lived, and went over to John Adams's place and looked at how he lived in Samuel Otis's guest room, who do you think that they would go after? I think it's pretty clear. Anyway, Thomas Jefferson supported what was happening in France, even though it was pretty gruesome. And he helped to start a newspaper, which was called the National Gazette. And this was a paper that made a lot of unfair claims about the Federalists, particularly Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. Jefferson, through the paper, made the case that the Federalists were trying to create an aristocracy in the United States. They were too much like the British. Okay, this thing about being pro-British or pro-French, I don't think has been explained well. When we think about England, did have a strong aristocracy, like the king and the aristocrats owned most things, but England had a growing middle class too. Small tradesmen, people who had in the 1790s, we're talking about small factories, but factories. Okay, France was very different because it's a very, very small, much more limited middle class. And the king and the aristocrats owned almost everything over there. So it makes some sense to favor the British system, maybe without the aristocracy. That would be somebody like John Adams. If we want to talk about aristocracy, we're talking about people like Thomas Jefferson, right? These hyper wealthy people who have a bunch of other people who work without pay, right? His tenant farmers and the people he held in bondage, right? I mean, those would be the people to rise up. Who's going to rise up against John Adams? Anyway, yeah, so the Federalists tended to have they tended to look to England, let's say, a little bit, but really not that much. Not nearly as much as the Republicans claimed in their newspapers. All right. The Federalist paper was the Gazette of the United States. I don't know why they had such similar names. But these two publications would write stories and send out copies, issues to other parts of the country, and local papers would carry their stories to try to get the word out of what their perspective was about things. Now, so we have the two parties, and the question is who is going to be our ticket in 1792? George Clinton wanted to be Washington's running mate, again, as he had been in 1789. George Clinton had a problem in 1792 because through the 1780s, Clinton's popularity was on the decline in New York State. And his elections were getting closer and closer and closer, but he kept winning. The last time that he had won was in 1789. Remember, they were voting on the day that George Washington was inaugurated. George Clinton won that time. Relatively close, but he won. Well, in 1792, because it was a 3-year term, Clinton was up for re-election, and the Federalists nominated John Jay, the Chief Justice. And it was a close election, but the people of New York State elected John Jay as their governor. George Clinton decided he was going to fix that. So what he did to fix it was he got people to challenge the vote in 3 different counties where John Jay had carried. And the Board of Canvassers eventually decided to throw those 3 counties out, which meant that George Clinton got reelected. A lot of people were upset about this, that he had done this. And so the Republicans over the summer of 1792 are thinking, wow, do we really want this guy for vice president? I mean, this was pretty obnoxious to a lot of people. So they were talking about other people. Now, one of the names that came up a lot was Thomas Jefferson. He's an obvious alternative candidate for vice president, right? He had a problem, though, which was he was from Virginia, which meant the presidential electors from Virginia could not legally vote for George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Okay, some people were trying to figure this out, and some people were looking at Aaron Burr. Now, Aaron Burr was in the U.S. Senate from New York State, and he had an interesting story because throughout a lot of New York's history, early history in the federal government, the state had 3 political interest groups. The interfederal, the one group that supported George Clinton and later DeWitt Clinton, the Clintonians, and the Federalists. Those were the 2 primary ones. But then they had a third interest group, which are non-Federalist and also non-Clintonites. These people were a little amorphous from time to time. Aaron Burr was one of those people. Eventually, Martin Van Buren organizes them into the Bucktails and makes them a more potent political force. But New York State had these 3 that sort of jockeyed for position, roughly equal in popular support. Okay, so those people would be inclined to support Aaron Burr because they're trying to sort of get past this George Clinton era. This meant that later in 1792, you can see how late it is. This is weeks before people are going to start voting for in 1792 in the election. Republican leaders from 4 states gathered in Philadelphia to discuss, all right, we have to pick somebody and go with it because otherwise our vice presidential vote is going to be scattered. So they decided to support George Clinton. Now, George Washington did not want to serve a second term. He didn't want to serve a first term, but he did. And in the spring of 1792, Washington actually asked James Madison to write a farewell address for him. He wanted to go home to Mount Vernon. He had some issues. His hearing wasn't good. His memory was slipping a little bit. And another thing is that his false teeth really hurt. And he just wanted to go home. So at the cabinet meeting, they would discuss this from time to time. And this one time, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were saying, oh, we need you to stay. It's so important for the health of the country. And then Hamilton and Jefferson got into this really loud argument about sort of where the government needed to go. And it got to be so bad, George Washington had to separate the two of them. Eventually, about the time that the Republicans picked George Clinton officially, Washington agreed he would run again. And John Adams had gone home at the end while Congress was out of session. He went back to Massachusetts. He was particularly opposed to what he called electioneering, or we would call campaigning, asking for votes. He just felt that that was not what people, you're supposed to elect people because they were the right people, not because they asked you to vote for them. Okay, so he was at home in Braintree/Quincy. And Alexander Hamilton was writing to him. It's like, Pennsylvania is a really important state. We have to win Pennsylvania to win this thing. We need you to come back so we can have stories running in the Gazette of the United States that can go around about John Adams is here and why you should vote for him, right? Well, Adams was just not into that at all. He just didn't want to deal with it. Congress was scheduled to reconvene, and he did show up for that. But some states had already voted at that point. But he did come. Okay, so now we have our slates. George Washington is everybody's choice for president. I forgot to change right there. Federalists and Republicans, it should be. Then the Federalists support John Adams for the second electoral vote, and the Republicans support George Clinton for the second electoral vote. Same as in 1789, same people. So let's look at how states chose presidential electors. 9 of them appointed presidential electors, which are the ones in this sort of reddish brown color. It looks like a lot of the states there, but the larger states tended to choose presidential electors by popular vote rather than by the legislature. And they used 2 means, the statewide vote, which was used in 3 states. This is what was called at the time the general ticket, where you would vote for a list of people to cast electoral votes, as opposed to districts, where you would vote for one person to cast the electoral vote of that district, which was used in 3 states. So then there you'll see on the right the sequence of when the states voted. I couldn't find when Kentucky voted. I assumed it was the same day as Virginia because it had just been separated from Virginia, but I couldn't find it, so I'm not sure. You can see the first 3 dates are pretty close. Maryland voted, about a week later? And again, this whole thing about states not voting at the same time wasn't a big deal in 1792 because of communications hampered the delivery of information around. For example, by the 1820s, this was becoming a problem because states who voted early would influence states who voted late. And some people won presidential elections that would not have been elected if everybody voted at the same time. But that was the system, right? Okay. So here we go with oh, you know what? I need to say one other thing about the district vote. This is really important because in Virginia and in Kentucky, where presidential electors were chosen by districts, none of the popular vote of those 2 states survives for 1792. What that means is, in this table coming up, the popular vote of those presidential electors, the Republicans, is understated. And you'll see why that sort of makes sense. Because here's the table with a breakdown of the votes that we have for Federalist electors and Republicans and the total. So the total is George Washington's vote. The Federalist vote is for John Adams, and the Republican vote is for George Clinton. And you'll see here the middle column of numbers is presidential electors chosen by the popular vote. So the Federalists win that 47-27. Then the last column are appointments by the legislatures, which the Federalists win 33-28. Now you'll see that some accounts say that when people went to the polls, they elected Democratic Republicans, and the legislatures are the ones who appointed Federalist presidential electors. That happened sometimes, but not in 1792. The Federalists won both categories. So, what that meant is that presidential electors were chosen in each state, and they cast the electoral votes on December 5. And again, when they met, every presidential elector cast 2 electoral votes. They didn't distinguish president versus vice president. Although in this article right here, you'll see, this is Connecticut, that presidential electors voted unanimously for Washington for president, Adams for vice president. Okay, now the next paragraph is really important because if you remember what Alexander Hamilton had done in 1789, he was trying to influence presidential electors as to how to vote. All right, here's something that I've never seen any historian discuss this, and sort of interesting because it's easy to complain about Alexander Hamilton doing it because historians tend not to like the Federalist. But when the Democratic Republicans do it, historians just ignore it. Because it says right here that the Democratic Republicans wrote to the presidential electors and asked them to vote for George Clinton. They're trying to win this election, right? Yeah. Okay. So presidential electors, everybody votes for 2 people. They appoint somebody as messenger to carry their electoral vote to the vice president's office, and they mail 1 copy, and 1 goes to the local judge. So the obvious happens again. George Washington wins unanimously, right? He gets 132 electoral votes. 3 electors failed to show up, and those 2 states had forgotten to pass legislation saying that whoever showed up got to fill the vacancies, which becomes standard after this, although states occasionally forget to do that, and this happens again from time to time that there's a vacancy in the electoral vote. So this is the map you always see. Now, as in 1789, I'm going to show you the map that you never see. I don't know that this has ever been shown before, but this is the real race of 1792. John Adams won all of New England and most of the middle colonies, not the middle states, to get 77 electoral votes, and he's reelected. George Clinton won 4 states. He got 50 electoral votes. The presidential electors in Kentucky voted for Thomas Jefferson. Now, 1 Federalist in South Carolina voted for Aaron Burr, and 1 Federalist in Pennsylvania voted for George Clinton, meaning that John Adams lost several votes. He lost 1 in Vermont, he lost 1 in Pennsylvania, he lost 2 in Maryland, and 1 in South Carolina. One interesting thing about this is when the presidential electors met in North Carolina, they held a discussion of, okay, who would be the better person to serve as vice president? Would it be John Adams or would it be George Clinton? So you have these 12 guys. Probably none of these had ever met either one of these 2 people. But they're making a decision who they want to be vice president and decide to go to vote for George Clinton, which is kind of interesting because he had just stolen the election for governor of New York. But whatever, that's what they did. Okay, so now we have our winners, and people are traveling to deliver the results of the meetings of presidential electors. to Philadelphia, where John Adams was serving as vice president. And the Congressional Joint Session was held in the U.S. Senate Chamber February 13, 1793. In future presentations like this, I probably won't go into the joint session every time. It's not super important, but sometimes, I mean, this is a shorter presentation, less to say. So I did want to mention it, plus to go over some things that happened this year. It was slightly different from 1789. But from this point forward, most of what I'm getting ready to tell you is consistent from year to year. Okay, number one, the vice president presided. That didn't always happen. Like when George Clinton is vice president and he decided he wanted to run for president and he didn't win that, he didn't show up to preside. Sometimes the vice president was not there for whatever reason. Most of the time, the vice president does that. Okay. So the House and Senate appoint tellers, and this is fairly standard that the House will appoint 2 tellers. Now, what happens here is the vice president would sit up in that chair that you see. The House tellers would take the certificates from the states and they would alternate. One of them would read one while the second guy is opening his. Then he would read his while the first guy opens his. So they would go back and forth, and this went pretty quickly. There weren't that many states back then. Now, in 1793, the 2 House tellers were both Federalists. Since that time, it's usually the case that the 2 main parties each have one of these 2 people. So it's usually one Democrat and one Republican. Okay, those are the House tellers. They're reading the electoral votes. The Senate appoints a teller, and that person's role is to record this. So this person, who's mostly been a man, will sit there and make a table of every state and how they voted for president, and later for vice president once these are distinguished from each other. So the first person to do that was Rufus King, who comes up in some of our later presentations. He does the recording. Then at the end of that process, the Senate teller will add up the electoral votes for every candidate, and hand that to the person who presides, usually the vice president. And that person would say, so and so was elected president, so and so was elected vice president. So John Adams did that in 1793. Okay, so what that means is we have people elected, and since they were both there in Philadelphia, there was no need for this notification that happened in 1789. Inauguration date, remember the Electoral Act of 1792 set it for March 4. This was the inauguration day, the federal one, until 1933. The presidential inauguration, Washington was inaugurated in the U.S. Senate chamber. William Cushing here, an associate justice of the Supreme Court, administered the oath to George Washington. Then Washington gave his inaugural address, which was the shortest of all of them. One thing that's kind of interesting about 1793 in this inauguration is it's debated about whether John Adams was there. A few days after the joint session of Congress, Adams stopped attending the U.S. Senate to preside. The newspapers are pretty clear that John Adams went home and was not there the day that Washington was inaugurated. Some historians say that he was there. I haven't really tried to sort all this stuff out, whether he was there that day or not. Apparently, Thomas Jefferson really stood out that day because he was wearing a blue suit when most people were kind of wearing darker colors. Um, so anyway, I don't know, whatever. You can see these two guys, William Cushing and John Langdon, are wearing these wigs. Wigs were kind of common thing of the late 1700s, early 1800s. And you can see there they're kind of thinner at the top and they usually get heavier towards the bottom, often with curls like William Cushing's curls here. For some reason, they had this idea that men with white hair were more wise, I guess. I don't know. One, I was looking up some stuff about like when were wigs more common, and this one guy said that George Washington never wore a wig, but if you look at these pictures, particularly the ones I'm showing in this presentation, he's clearly wearing one because wigs have this common tendency that they're thicker at the bottom, like around the ears, rather than on the top. Okay, well, some people like Edmund Randolph, if you remember back then, he earlier in this presentation, he was not wearing a wig. Okay, so John Langdon, who's on the lower right, President Pro Tem of the Senate, inaugurated John Adams as vice president on December the 2nd, 1793, which is a long time, months after Washington was inaugurated. This happened both times, right? With John Adams, he took the oath long after George Washington. That was kind of rare. After this, usually the president and vice president are inaugurated on the same day. Not always. Some exceptions will come up. Okay, so here we have our team again for another term. George Washington as president and John Adams as vice president. So next time we'll look at what happened in their second term and sort of what the circumstances are around John Adams's election to become the second president. So thanks so much for joining me. I hope you found this, enjoyable and informative. I like to do these sort of deep dives into these things because it's kind of interesting to understand sort of the mechanics of how things worked in presidential elections, which I think some people are kind of have more interest in than others. So if this was something that you found valuable, I hope you'll consider subscribing and leave me a message if you'd like to. So thanks once again, and I'm planning to have the next one about the election of 1796 ready for a week from today. So thanks so much, and I'll see you then.